Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The elemental kingdom had never known democracy. For centuries, it was ruled by four powerful families, each in control of one of the fundamental elements: water, fire, earth, and wind. Their hold over the kingdom was absolute, their reign passed down through generations, and the common people lived in the shadow of their elemental might. But for the first time in history, the people were promised something different: a chance to elect a president, someone who would represent the entire kingdom, not just the interests of one elemental family. It was a momentous occasion, filled with hope, tension, and uncertainty. In the capital city, the streets buzzed with excitement. Banners and flags fluttered in the wind, each one bearing the colors of one of the four elemental families. At the center of the chaos stood the four candidates, each representing their family and the element they controlled. There was Aquera of the water family, cool and composed, her campaign focused on diplomacy and balance. Ignatius, the fiery and aggressive candidate from the fire family, promised a radical change and a new order. Darren, from the earth family, offered stability and tradition, his speeches filled with promises of protection and preservation. And Zephyr, the youngest and most innovative of the candidates, represented the wind family, advocating for progress and flexibility in a rapidly changing world. The election had stirred the kingdom in ways it had never been stirred before. For the first time, the common people were being given a voice, a chance to influence the future of the kingdom. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken tension. The elemental families had ruled for so long that many feared they would not relinquish power so easily. Some whispered that the election was just a show, a way for the families to maintain their dominance while giving the illusion of choice. Others believed that real change was possible, that the kingdom could move beyond the elemental divisions that had defined it for centuries. In the midst of this political storm was Arthur, a young man of no particular significance. He worked as a blacksmith's apprentice in the capital, hammering away at horseshoes and swords with little thought to the grand events unfolding around him. Like most commoners, Arthur had resigned himself to a life of toil, watching from the sidelines as the elemental families fought for power. He had no reason to believe that he could be anything more than what he was: a simple man living in a world controlled by forces far beyond his reach. But fate had other plans for Arthur. It was an ordinary day in the forge, the heat of the fire blazing in front of him as he pounded a piece of iron into shape. Sweat dripped down his brow, and the rhythmic clang of the hammer against metal filled the small workshop. Suddenly, without warning, a strange sensation washed over him. His hand faltered, and the hammer slipped from his grip, clattering to the ground. Arthur gasped, clutching his chest as a surge of energy pulsed through him, unlike anything he had ever felt before. The fire in the forge roared to life, flames leaping higher and higher until they licked the ceiling. The wind outside howled, shaking the walls of the workshop, while the ground beneath Arthur's feet trembled as if an earthquake were about to split the earth in two. Water from the nearby trough bubbled and hissed, as if boiling from some unseen heat. Arthur stumbled back, his heart racing. He raised his hands instinctively, trying to shield himself from the elemental chaos erupting around him. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The flames died down, the wind quieted, the earth stilled, and the water returned to a calm state. Arthur stood there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind reeling from what had just happened. What was that? He thought, staring at his trembling hands. He had no explanation for what he had just experienced, but deep down, he knew something had changed within him. Something powerful. Unsure of what to do, Arthur sought out the only person he thought might have answers: Alara, the old hermit who lived on the outskirts of the city. Alara had once served as a spiritual advisor to the elemental families, though she had long since withdrawn from the political world, choosing instead to live a life of solitude. Arthur had heard rumors of her wisdom, of the secrets she had learned in her years of service to the kingdom. If anyone could explain what was happening to him, It would be her. The journey to Alara's home was long and arduous, but Arthur was driven by a need for answers. When he finally arrived, he found the old woman sitting outside her small cottage, tending to a garden of herbs. She looked up as he approached, her sharp eyes studying him with a knowing gaze. "You've come because something has awakened within you," Alara said before Arthur could even open his mouth to speak. Her voice was soft but carried an air of authority. Arthur hesitated, unsure of how to explain the events that had unfolded in the forge. "A broken bar, I don't know what's happening to me," he said finally. "There was fire, and wind, and a broken bar. Everything was out of control." Alara nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting this. "You are experiencing the elemental convergence," she said. "It is a rare phenomenon, one that occurs only once every few generations. You have awakened the power of all four elements, something that has not been seen in centuries." Arthur stared at her, his mind struggling to comprehend what she was saying. "All four elements? With a broken bar, only the elemental families can control them." "That is what we have been led to believe," Alara said, a hint of bitterness in her voice. "But the truth is that the elements belong to no one. They are forces of nature, and sometimes, they choose an unlikely vessel to carry their power. You are one of those vessels." Arthur felt a surge of disbelief. "But I'm just a blacksmith, how can you question mark?" "Power does not care where it comes from," Alara interrupted. "The question is not whether you are worthy of it, but what you will do with it." Arthur fell silent, the weight of her words settling over him. What would he do with it? He had no desire for power, no ambitions beyond his simple life in the forge. And yet, something deep inside him stirred at the thought of using his newfound abilities to challenge the elemental families. He had seen the way they ruled over the kingdom, using their powers to keep the common people in line. He had heard the whispers of discontent, the cries for change that went unheard by those in power. Maybe, just maybe, he could be the one to make a difference. Alara seemed to sense his thoughts, and her expression softened. "Be careful, Arthur," she said quietly. "The elemental families will not take kindly to someone like you disrupting their carefully balanced world. They will see you as a threat, and they will try to destroy you." Arthur nodded, though he wasn't sure what he was agreeing to. All he knew was that he couldn't ignore what was happening inside him. The power of the elements had chosen him for a reason, and he couldn't walk away from it now. In the weeks that followed, Arthur began to test the limits of his abilities. At first, it was small things as summoning a gust of wind to blow out a candle, coaxing a flicker of flame from his fingertips, shaping a stone into a smooth pebble with a touch. But as his confidence grew, so did the scale of his experiments. He learned to control the elements with greater precision, combining them in ways that even the elemental families had never dreamed of. Word of Arthur's abilities began to spread, though he tried to keep a low profile. People whispered about the young blacksmith who could wield all four elements, and some even claimed to have seen him perform miraculous feats. Arthur didn't want the attention, but it was impossible to avoid. The kingdom was in the midst of an election, and any sign of power, especially power that did not come from the elemental families, was bound to attract notice. It wasn't long before Arthur found himself drawn into the political fray. He had never been interested in politics before, but now, with the weight of the elements behind him, he couldn't ignore the growing unrest in the kingdom. The common people were beginning to demand more from their leaders, and Arthur knew that he had a role to play in the coming battle for the future of the elemental kingdom. He began attending political debates and rallies, not as a candidate, but as a concerned citizen. At first, his presence went largely unnoticed, but as he started to speak out against the elemental families and their grip on power, people began to listen. Arthur's words resonated with the commoners, who were tired of living under the thumb of the elemental families. He spoke of equality, of a kingdom where the elements belonged to everyone, not just the privileged few. Arthur's words gained traction faster than he had anticipated. What began as murmurs among the crowds at the debates quickly grew into roaring approval. especially from the common people who had long felt oppressed by the elemental families. His message was clear: the power of the elements should belong to the kingdom as a whole, not just to the chosen few. People were drawn to the notion that someone from a humble background, someone like them, could wield the forces that had long been monopolized by the elite families. But Arthur's growing influence did not go unnoticed by the elemental families. In the grand halls of their ancestral homes, discussions grew tense. Ignatius, ever the firebrand, was the first to call for action against Arthur. He viewed Arthur's presence not just as a threat to his candidacy but to the very structure of power in the elemental kingdom. His temper flared during meetings with the other candidates, his voice booming as he argued that Arthur's rise could spell the end of their family's dominance. "We cannot allow a commoner to challenge everything we've built," Ignatius spat, his eyes blazing with fury. "He must be stopped, or the people will begin to believe they can govern themselves. It will be chaos." Aquila, always calm and deliberate, raised her hand to quiet the room. "We must be cautious," she said. "Arthur has awakened powers we have not seen in centuries. If we act recklessly, we may only serve to strengthen his cause." Darren, ever the voice of tradition, nodded. "Aquila is right. The people are watching us closely. If we move against Arthur too openly, it will confirm what they already believe, that we fear change." Zephyr, leaning against a pillar with a thoughtful expression, smiled slightly. "Perhaps we can turn this to our advantage," he said, his voice as light as the wind he commanded. "Arthur may have power, but power alone does not win elections. He's untested, untrained in the ways of politics. Let him enter the race. We'll defeat him where it matters most in the eyes of the people." Despite their differences, the candidates agreed that allowing Arthur into the election would be their best course of action. They would crush him not through force, but through political maneuvering. Arthur, they believed, was no match for the centuries of experience the elemental families had in ruling the kingdom. Arthur, however, had no intention of playing by their rules. His entry into the race was met with mixed reactions. The elemental families were, at least publicly, gracious about his sudden candidacy, though their true feelings were hidden behind polite smiles. They wasted no time in using their vast resources to launch personal attacks against him, questioning his qualifications and ridiculing his lack of formal training. Ignatius, in particular, made sure to highlight Arthur's background, emphasizing the fact that he came from a line of laborers rather than rulers. "Power is not enough," Ignatius said during a public debate. "You may control the elements, Arthur, but you lack the wisdom to lead a kingdom. Leadership is in our blood, passed down through the generations. You cannot simply awaken one day and expect to understand what it takes to govern." Arthur stood on the stage, listening to the fiery accusations without flinching. When his turn came, he stepped forward, his gaze steady. "I may not come from a line of rulers," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "But I understand what it means to be one of the people. The power of the elements isn't something that should be inherited by blood. It belongs to all of us, just as this kingdom belongs to all of us. The time for a new order is here." His words struck a chord with the audience, especially among the commoners who had long felt excluded from the political process. The applause was deafening, and Arthur could see the frustration in the eyes of the other candidates. They had underestimated him. They had thought they could dismiss him as a political novice, but Arthur was proving to be more formidable than any of them had anticipated. As the election approached, tensions in the kingdom grew. Arthur's rallies were packed with people eager to hear him speak, while the elemental families doubled down on their efforts to secure their traditional base of support. The air was thick with anticipation, and it seemed that the kingdom was on the brink of something monumental. On the night before the final debate, Arthur received an unexpected visitor. Alara, the hermit who had first explained his powers to him, appeared at his door. Her expression was grave, and Arthur sensed that something was wrong. "They're planning something," she said without preamble. "The elemental families know they can't beat you in the election, So they're going to try to discredit you in another way. Arthur frowned. What do you mean? They plan to challenge you to a duel, Alara explained. Ignatius, specifically. He believes that if he can defeat you in combat, it will prove that you are unworthy of leading the kingdom. Arthur's heart sank. While he had grown more confident in his control of the elements, he knew that Ignatius was a master of fire. A duel with him would not be easy, and the stakes would be incredibly high. If he lost, it could undo all the progress he had made. But there's more, Alara continued. They plan to rig the duel. Ignatius has been practicing a forbidden technique, one that allows him to draw on the power of other elements. If he uses it, he'll have an unfair advantage. Arthur clenched his fists. He should have known that the elemental families wouldn't play fair. But he also knew that backing down wasn't an option. If he refused the duel, it would only make him look weak in the eyes of the people. He had no choice but to face Ignatius head-on. The day of the duel arrived, and the kingdom gathered in the grand arena to witness what would surely be a historic event. The atmosphere was electric, the air thick with anticipation and tension. Arthur stood at one end of the arena, his heart pounding in his chest, while Ignatius stood at the other, his eyes blazing with the intensity of the fire he commanded. The duel began with a flurry of attacks. Ignatius wasted no time in unleashing his fiery fury, hurling massive fireballs in Arthur's direction. But Arthur was ready. With a flick of his wrist, he summoned a wall of water to douse the flames, the hiss of steam filling the air as fire met water. The crowd gasped, their eyes glued to the spectacle unfolding before them. Arthur countered with a blast of wind, sending Ignatius stumbling back, but the fire candidate quickly recovered, using his mastery of flames to launch another barrage of fire. The two combatants danced around the arena, their powers clashing in a dazzling display of elemental magic. But as the duel wore on, it became clear that Ignatius was using more than just fire. Arthur could feel the shift in the air as Ignatius called upon the forbidden technique Alara had warned him about. Suddenly, Ignatius was controlling not just fire, but also wind and earth, combining the elements in ways that gave him an overwhelming advantage. Arthur's heart raced as he struggled to keep up. The ground beneath him shook as Ignatius summoned an earthquake, and the wind howled as he used it to fan the flames of his fire attacks. For a moment, it seemed as though Arthur was going to lose. But then, something inside him shifted. In that moment of desperation, Arthur tapped into the full extent of his powers. He could feel the energy of all four elements coursing through him, stronger than ever before. He was no longer just controlling the elements, he was becoming one with them. With a surge of determination, Arthur unleashed a combination of all four elements in a way that stunned the crowd. Fire, water, wind, and earth swirled together in perfect harmony, creating a powerful vortex that enveloped Ignatius and rendered his attacks useless. The crowd watched in awe as Arthur stood tall, his power radiating from him in waves. Ignatius, realizing he had been outmatched, collapsed to his knees, the fire in his eyes extinguished. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising in a deafening roar of approval. Arthur had won the duel and with it, the hearts of the people. The election was a landslide. Arthur's victory in the duel had solidified his position as the candidate of the people, and when the votes were counted, it was clear that the kingdom had chosen a new leader. Arthur stood before the kingdom, his heart filled with a mixture of pride and humility. He had never sought power, but now that it was his, he vowed to use it wisely. The elemental families, though reluctant, accepted the results of the election. They knew that the age of their absolute rule was over. The people of the elemental kingdom celebrated in the streets, knowing that they were entering a new era, one of equality, fairness, and shared power. Arthur, the young blacksmith who had once thought himself insignificant, had become the first president of the elemental kingdom, ushering in a future where the elements belonged to everyone. And as Arthur looked out over the crowd, he knew that this was only the beginning.